For over 50 years, Ruby Nell Sayles has devoted herself to working for racial justice in this country, starting with her participation in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Selma to Montgomery marches, and through decades of tireless work. She has devoted her life to the struggle for equality. Today, Ruby Sayles is founder and director of the Spirit House Project, a national organization that brings diverse peoples together to work for racial, economic, and social justice, as well as for spiritual maturity. On this important anniversary, I am honored and pleased to welcome Ruby Sayles to State of Belief Radio.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Ms. Sayles, do you remember what it meant to you and to your friends when Dr. King spoke to the 250,000 people gathered at the March on Washington?
Yes, it was a very important moment for my generation of those who could not attend the march. It was the first time in our history that we had seen such a large gathering of people of all colors, because don't forget, we grew up in the South, and never did we see black and white people gathered together. So this was an eye-opening experience, that it was possible for white people and black people to carve out a common ground for a common dream. And we were also very proud of Dr. King because we thought he was a great preacher who preached very much like what we heard in church every Sunday. I came out of the Baptist tradition, so his way of delivery was very familiar to me. And the whole sense of I have a dream represented a theology that undergirded black people for 300 years through enslavement and through segregation, and the ability to be prophetic and to dream in a world that reduced you to nothing, and to be able to deal with that reality of where you stood while at the same time having a dream and working very hard for that dream, even though there might not be evidence before you that that dream would be possible. So when I heard I have a dream, it was what I had heard in Sunday school every Sunday, when black people would say, send us somebody to get us out of bondage, when they would tell the story in Exodus about Moses.
Yes. Ms. Sayles, and I should just tell you so that we're on the same page, I am a Baptist also, and and Dr. King's rhetoric is the rhetoric that stirs me just like it stirred you. I want you to just for a second talk about the atmosphere where you lived, not in Washington, but where you lived, and if you will, talk a little about the experiences you had in Port Deposit, Alabama, and how that impacted the direction that your life took.
Actually, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, Fort Benning, Georgia. My father was a chaplain in the Army, and he very much contested segregation. I grew up so on the Army base, it was integrated. In Columbus, Georgia, it was deeply segregated. Black and white people lived in very different worlds, and there had been incidents of violence and even a lynching or two in Columbus, Georgia. So while it was not the most repressive city in the South, it was the representation of the apartheid that hung over the South like a blanket. And so we never understood how badly, as children, we didn't get the full impact of it because our parents were real geniuses. That was the genius that black people of that generation possessed, the ability to make you feel safe in an unsafe world, while at the same time understand that segregation did exist.
I'm curious at what you just said. Do you remember at what point you were really aware of the tremendous amount of prejudice against you just because of the color of your skin?
I was most aware of it when I rode the buses. I always had a deep rebellion in me about sitting on the back of a bus. So when my friend and I would go shopping, I am ashamed to admit it, but I would pretend that I was spastic as an excuse to sit in the first seat that I came to. And then when we would get to our stop, I would jump off the bus normally, and we would all fall out laughing. So I think my deep resistance was around the bus, the real understanding.
I mentioned Port Deposit because that is a place that has a special significance for you as well, because that's where the shooting took place that impacted your life in such a way. Would you tell our listeners about that experience?
Well, many African Americans in Fort Deposit were sharecroppers, and they were required to shop at the company store, and they would be cheated out of their yield, the profit from the yield. And so the young people, African-American young people in Fort Deposit, got very tired and very resentful of the treatment that their sharecropping parents received. So they came to SNCC and wanted to organize a demonstration in Fort Deposit to protest the economic exploitation of their parents and other sharecroppers in that community. And so they were in the forefront of the organizing. We came along as support. And on the day so this is SNCC, and these are young people in Fort Deposit. And on the day of the demonstration, it was my first encounter with white violence. There were people there with shotguns, garbage pan handles, tops, sticks, bats. And so they were threatening to kill us, beat us up. And it got so out of control, we were taken to jail. I guess to stop the possible vigilante violence, we were taken to jail on a garbage truck. And when I say we, I say Stokely Carmichael, I say Jonathan Daniels, I say Father Richard Marshrow. And neither one of them had been in Lowndes County very long. So we were taken to jail. Stokely had been there, but I meant Richard and Jonathan. And Richard was a priest, and Jonathan was a seminarian from the Episcopal Divinity School. They were white, and we were all African Americans. And we were put in jail for 7 days. I was very sick, without food and water, and then out of nowhere we were told that we were free to go. And we protested that, and we were run out of jail at the butt of a shotgun and told to get the hell out of the jail. And it was one of those hot summer days in the South where the heat palpitates from the cement. And we were very hot, we were young, and we were thirsty. So the group selected Jonathan Daniels, Father Marshrow, Joyce Bill, a local African-American woman that had been in jail with us, and myself, to go to the corner cash grocery store where we had been many times to get sodas. And when we got to the door, this man whom I had never seen before, Tom Coleman, was standing in the door waving a shotgun and uttered profanities that start with a B, "I'll blow your brains out." And before I could process what he said, Jonathan pulled me. I was in front. Jonathan pulled me from behind, and I fell on the ground. And the next thing I knew, Tom Coleman had shot Jonathan Daniels. And Father Marshrow was running with Joyce Bailey, protecting her. And the next thing I knew, Tom Coleman had shot him, and he was lying on the cement, begging for water. And some of the SNCC members, including myself, tried to go over and give him water. And Tom Coleman forbade us to give him water and said that if we tried to give him water, he would kill all of us. So we had to leave. And I understand from Father Richard Marshrow that he was taken to the hospital in a hearse on top of Jonathan's dead body. And as you know, Tom Coleman was found not guilty, and he never served a day for the murder of Jonathan Daniels and the mutilation of Father Richard Marshrow.
You know, I mean, it is just painful to hear you tell that story. And I'm sitting here. I've got another question I want to ask, but I've got to sidetrack from it just a minute and ask you, how in the world, after watching that kind of thing happen, how in the world could you ever love this nation and want to work as you've worked in it?
Well, I love this nation because I am an American. I have no other nation to love. My father loved this nation enough to go and fight for it. And my family, that generation of African Americans who raised their children, refused to teach us to hate. We were forbidden to hate. If we said we hated somebody, our parents would get very upset. So I came out of a theology of love. It never occurred to me to hate white people, but what it did occur to me was to contest their behavior. So I see this as my country, and I have a stake in making sure that the threads of democracy are strong. And so I've never looked at it that way. As a matter of fact, I feel being in the movement gave me an opportunity to get to know a different kind of white person, more than the white people whom I had known in the South who were segregationists.
Yeah.
And it gave them an opportunity to be acquainted with a different kind of black person, not someone who worked for them as their maid, but someone who worked side by side with them as allies in the Southern Freedom Movement. So I look at the possibilities while dealing with the realities.
Ms. Sales, as we remember the 1963 March on Washington and the role it played in the Civil Rights Movement, it's important that we look at the parts of Dr. King's dream that have not yet been fulfilled. I know that you're doing some very specific work, and I want to get to that in just a minute. But I first want to ask you about the broad direction our nation is taking right now with an African-American president who we nonetheless seem stuck in some very old racial patterns. And I just would like to get your perspective on whether you think that's true and where you see that having the most impact in this nation.
Well, first of all, I think that is very, very true. And I think before the ink was dry on the voting rights bill, that there were Southerners who were engaged in trying to undo the rights that had been gained by the Southern Freedom Movement, because they saw those rights as a direct threat to their power and even to their humanity. And so that I think that while many people thought that we had reached a utopia in this country, we never stopped dealing with racism. It was evidenced in the segregation of schools where African American youth were transferred out of their neighborhood schools, and these neighborhood schools were torn down, and they were forced to go to white schools, separate themselves from their culture, from their mascots, from adults who had been pivotal in the lives of African Americans, who had in many ways birthed the students in the Southern Freedom Movement. And so that was the first assault on the schooling of African American youth, and we see that having reverberating effects today. And the next assault was on the demonization of African American people, moving them, the nation's vision of them as a glorious people who had fought and won in the Southern Freedom Movement without firing a shot, to deadbeat fathers and crack-headed welfare queen mothers. And that was a setup so that white people who were involved in this movement to regain or reclaim power created a propaganda that allowed them to use vicious tools against black people without the nation raising an outcry, because the nation bought into the consciousness that black people were second-class people once again, immoral, different from all other people, who didn't value education and who'd rather buy crack than to support their children. So that tearing down of the black public issue also is a critical issue in this country, and is the fertile ground for a lot of the silence that permeates around racism. Another area where it is very obvious is in the economic realities of the prison industrial complex, where black people are imprisoned in unprecedented numbers to support an economic system, while whites continue in old plantation system where they live off the backs of black labor. This is very prominent in the South, and that includes the probation for profit system, where if you get a $100 ticket, the courts have been privatized, and you have to go through a private company, and that $100 ticket could escalate before you even walk out of the door to $400. Once again, building an economic system on the backs of African Americans. Wow. I do not believe that the goal of the Southern Freedom Movement was to elect a president. I think it was to build a world house where people could live together in a just, righteous democracy and have a change of hearts in our relationship towards each other, God, and all forms of creation. So I don't believe that we reached a certain golden era with a black president.
Well, you are so articulate and so insightful in sharing your perspective. I do want to talk about something that I know is very, very important to you as well. You've been traveling the country documenting some very disturbing events, and I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that work, which is something probably most Americans don't even know about.
Yes, just as it happened after Black Reconstruction, where blacks had enjoyed unprecedented political power, economic and social power, there was a rise of white supremacy, a resurgence of white supremacy held together by terrorism and violence. We see that trend developing today where across the nation, black young people and some black older people, men and women, are experiencing grave violence. For example, we went down to Lucedale, Mississippi, where Billy Joe Johnson, an African-American man, 17 years old, who had scholarships to most of the major universities because he was an outstanding athlete, was coming home one early morning. The deputy stopped him and went to check his license plate. And when the deputy came back, he said that Billy Joe Johnson had taken a shotgun and blown his brains out. Very suspicious death. There was the family was not allowed to see their son as he lay in the street for 7 hours. The mother fainted. The only two people who were allowed to see this young man was the coach and the superintendent of schools. And then he was sent away to Jackson, Mississippi for an autopsy, and his family were not allowed to even view his body until he came back home. And when he came back home, certain body parts below the belt were missing. And then there's Chavis Carter, who was arrested in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was put in the police car, handcuffed, and chained. His legs were chained, his ankles were chained, and his arms were bound, hands were bound. And he was frisked. And then later on, the police said that he had a concealed weapon, and that he took out the weapon and blew his brains out. And so that this is just two cases, but since Trayvon Martin's murder, there have been 29 people who've been killed, 29 African-American people. I've tabulated the deaths since 2001, and they're in the range of 40 to 50 deaths.
Ms. Sayles, did you see, in what you found, do you see signs of conspiracy, or is it just a pattern of indifference or a lack of professionalism? How do you view that?
Well, first of all, indifference doesn't put a bullet in anyone's head.
Right.
Indifference doesn't hang somebody from a tree. I think it's the use of things that worked before that silenced black people and kept us in a state of apartheid for over 100 years. I think these are the same tactics that are being utilized. And I think some of these tactics are promoted by ELEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, who basically have reinstituted states' rights by doing boilerplate legislation that they filter from state to state. And in doing this, they have subverted the power of Congress to really legislate in the way that it did during the Southern Freedom Movement. And so we live in a society today of states' rights in the South, white terrorism in the South, and a lockdown society. Do I think it's a conspiracy? I don't know about a conspiracy, but I do know it's white billionaires, Republicans, Tea Parties, ordinary people in a coalition to regain white supremacy in a two-thirds colored world. So I wouldn't want to talk about conspiracy, but I'd talk about them being darn good organizers.
Yeah. Ms. Sayles, you've been really generous with your time. I have one more question, because I know that you're going to be a part of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. As you participate in that this weekend, what comes to mind that would be, and I know it's too simple to put it in
Right.
real simplistic terms, but what comes to mind that about what would have the greatest impact on a real change in the civil rights movement today that is more progressive?
Well, I think, first of all, to understand that the civil rights movement was more than about laws. It was about the dignity and the efficacy of black people as being citizens and the children of God. And so to have a larger, expansive understanding of what that movement was about and how it freed both black and white people from the burdens of segregation. And so what I would like people to remember is that first and foremost, the Southern Freedom Movement was a spiritual movement that gave each person an opportunity to transform their lives and to transform how they live in the world with each other, God, in every aspect of. And the other thing that I strongly call on the churches to move away from prosperity gospel to the gospel of human rights gospel, to a gospel where God is on the side of the poor, where God is on the side of people who fight for liberation. I believe that the church has a new role to play, and I hope it won't be silent as it was for 100 years during Southern apartheid. I believe that the church, this is a really Kairos moment, and also a difficult moment, but a Kairos moment in the sense of being able to sit at the edge on the chair of history and to shift the direction of this nation and to be called to do that. I don't think you can change anything without that kind of understanding that justice is both social and spiritual.
Ruby Nell Sayles is a lifelong civil rights activist, teacher, speaker, and organizer. She was there for some of the early actions by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and is founder and director of the Spirit House Project. You can find out more at spirithouse.org. Ms. Sayles, I can't tell you how I appreciate this conversation, as disturbing as it is. I'm not being trite when I say that Martin Luther King Jr. Would be really proud of you. And I thank you so much for being with us today on this significant anniversary. And I wish you strength and perseverance in your important work.
And the same to you. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to have voice in this great conversation in the nation about what next.